on to the second page. Okay, so we started with 4 vocab. I misspoke. It wasn't 5 vocab. It was 7 vocab words. But for the 5th one, we have linear pair. Linear pair is a pair of, adjacent angles. Remember, adjacent is the vocab word we learned over here. Okay. So a pair of adjacent angles whose non-common sides are opposite rays the angles of a linear pair form a straight angle. Okay, linear pair. So linear pair is an adjacent angles, which means they are right next to each other. Their non-common side are opposite rays, and they form a straight angle. So 1 and 2, angle 1 and angle 2, are a linear pair. Okay. Now with linear pair, we have a postulate, which is the linear pair postulate, which states that if 2 angles form a linear pair, then they are supplementary. Okay. Now remember, supplementary means that they have a sum of 180 degrees. Okay. So looking at this linear pair of angle 1 and angle 2, if the measure of angle 1 is 42 degrees, what is the measure of angle 2? So if we know this is 42 degrees, and we know the whole thing, this whole thing is 180 degrees, how do we find angle 2? We use subtraction. 180 minus 42. You can use your calculator if you need to. But you should come up with an answer of 138. So the measure of angle 2 is 138 degrees. Okay, and then last vocab word is angle bisector, which is a ray that divides an angle into 2 congruent angles. Its endpoint is at the angle's vertex. Okay, so in this image, the ray AY is the angle bisector of angle XAZ, because it is creating 2 congruent parts, which are indicated by your arcs. And the endpoint is at the vertex of the angle. And so our little notes here says that with an array, a segment with the same endpoint can also be considered an angle bisector. And we can also say that a ray or a segment bisects the angle, which we talked about means split in half, or 2 congruent parts. Okay, so those are your 7 vocab terms that you need to know for this section. The last thing before we do some examples are some things that you need to be able to find from a diagram. So there are some relationships that you can assume to be true from a diagram that has no marks or measures. And there's other relationships that you cannot assume directly. So basically, when you have an image, there's certain things that you can assume right away, and there's things that you can't assume. So the things that you can assume, the things you can conclude from the following, even though they are unmarked, you can assume or conclude that angles are adjacent. Try that again. Okay, so you don't need anything to mark that they're adjacent. We just know that them being next to each other are adjacent. We can conclude that angles are adjacent as well as supplementary. Okay, if they are similar to this, they're adjacent and supplementary. You can also conclude that angles are vertical angles. Okay, which is when the angles are across from each other in an image like this. Okay, so all those things can be concluded. You cannot conclude the following from unmarked diagrams. Okay, you cannot conclude that angles or segments are congruent. So just because they look the same does not mean they are the same. You cannot conclude that an angle is a right angle. Okay, unless it tells you or indicates it, you cannot assume anything is a right angle. And last but not least, you cannot conclude or assume that angles are complementary. Okay, they need to either be marked in such a way that shows that they're complementary, or they need to have numbers to prove that they add up to add up to 90 degrees. Okay, so be careful about what you can and cannot assume, and we'll go ahead and move on to our examples.